The smell of burnt sugar and expensive perfume collided in the stifling air of the Caldwell estate, as Emma stood paralyzed before the heavy oak desk. Her fingers, still stained with the flour of her dying bakery, trembled as she gripped a folder she was never meant to see. A paper trail of paid bribes and orchestrated lies that felt like a cold blade against her throat. Outside the heavy doors, the sound of her husband's carefree laughter echoed through the hallway, oblivious to the fact that his own mother was currently twisting the final cord around Emma's neck. A floorboard creaked behind her. Emma froze, the shadows of the study stretching like claws toward the documents in her hand. She had come here to play the part of the perfect wife, to survive one more suffocating family dinner. But the ink on the pages before her proved that the woman greeting guests downstairs wasn't just a mother-in-law. She was an executioner, as a hand reached for the brass doorknob from the other side. Emma realized she wasn't just fighting for her business anymore. She was standing in the center of a trap that had been set long before she ever said, "I do." The air inside Sugar String Bakery hung heavy, a thick shroud of cloying sweetness and punishing heat radiating from the industrial ovens. Emma Caldwell wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of white flour against her tan skin. Her fingers cramped into stiff claws as she pressed the metal mold into the stubborn, elastic dough for the 100th time that afternoon. The Thanksgiving rush had transformed her sanctuary into a frantic production line, and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sounded like a countdown. She tugged at the strings of her apron, trying to ignore the dull ache blooming in her lower back. Each handful of sugar she scattered over the crusts made a sound like breaking glass in the rare seconds of silence between oven timers. Emma hauled another heavy tray toward the cooling racks, her knees trembling while the red heat spots on her wrists throbbed with every movement. A sharp jangle from the bell above the door sliced through the hum of the refrigerators, admitting a gust of damp Charleston air and a man clad in a dripping raincoat. The courier didn't offer a greeting. He simply tossed a thick envelope, embossed with the seal of a major flour mill, onto the flour-dusted counter. Emma's fingers shook as she tore the paper open, a few cookie crumbs tumbling onto the formal typeface. The black ink of the notice, a summary termination of her flour supply contract, blurred as she read the words, "Immediate effect." The courier thrust a digital tablet toward her for a signature, his eyes fixed on his muddy boots as he shifted his weight. Emma gripped the edge of the wooden counter until her knuckles turned ivory, the realization sinking in that her reserved shipment of premium grain now belonged to someone else. The door had barely clicked shut behind the courier when a second figure materialized in the entryway, draped in a severe gray overcoat. This man carried a leather portfolio tucked under one arm and surveyed the display cases of Sugar String with a clinical, icy detachment. He flashed an ID badge that caught the fluorescent light, the plastic glinting as he introduced himself as a health inspector. Emma froze, wire whisk still in hand, watching him pull blue surgical booties over his shoes and calibrate a contactless thermometer. His voice carried a dry, bureaucratic rasp as he announced an unannounced sanitary inspection triggered by an anonymous complaint. Emma's mouth went bone dry, the steady rumble of her refrigeration units suddenly sounding like a predatory growl. The inspector's pen scratched against his notepad, marking the first of many entries. On the flour-caked prep table, Emma's phone began to dance, vibrating incessantly as notifications flooded the screen. She swiped a sticky thumb across the glass, and a barrage of one-star ratings and vitriolic comments surged into view. Total strangers were posting detailed accounts of mold found in eclairs and stray hairs baked into holiday loaves. Emma scrolled through the feed, seeing photos of mangled desserts that she had never produced, all tagged with her bakery's location. Each sentence felt like a physical blow, a systematic dismantling of the reputation she had spent years building with sweat and precision. She pressed a hand to her lips, watching the digital rating of Sugar String plummet toward 0 in real time. It was a coordinated execution, a digital erasure of her livelihood. The inspector moved with terrifying deliberation, sliding a heavy rack of baking sheets away from the wall to reveal a hairline fracture in the floor tile near the baseboard. Emma watched him document the breach of surface integrity, and a single bead of condensation clinging to the underside of the ventilation hood. Every stroke of his pen felt like a sentence handed down in an empty courtroom. She knew these petty observations would aggregate into a fine large enough to swallow her remaining capital. The walls she had painted herself, choosing the specific shade of pale yellow to evoke warmth, now felt alien and hostile under his scrutiny. The inspector snapped his portfolio shut with a sound like a pistol shot, and the noise echoed in Emma's skull. Sugar String was one signature away from being shuttered for good. A sudden, sharp blast of a car horn erupted from the street, followed by the sight of a gleaming black SUV pulling tight against the curb. Mark stepped out without killing the engine, his fingers fluttering nervously over the cuffs of his designer shirt as he peered through the bakery window. He burst inside, bringing a cloud of expensive cologne that clashed violently with the smell of scorched sugar. His eyes immediately sought the face of his watch, his hands gesturing wildly for Emma to drop everything. He reminded her of the family dinner at the Caldwell estate, a ritual where tardiness was treated as a high-level betrayal of the bloodline. Emma looked down at her stained, scorched hands, while Mark paced the narrow floor, his polished loafers crunching through the spilled flour on the boards. In the cramped back room, surrounded by towering sacks of sugar, Emma splashed freezing water onto her face to rinse away the dust of the day. She applied a thick layer of foundation, her fingers working frantically to hide the puffiness of unshed tears and the stress-induced flush on her cheeks. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking as she pulled on a silk emerald dress, the delicate fabric catching on the rough calluses of her palms. She forced her feet into narrow stilettos, stifling a groan as the sharp incline sent a jolt of pain through her exhausted arches. The mirror reflected a stranger, a woman with a perfect blowout and the haunted eyes of a cornered animal. Emma squared her shoulders and took a ragged breath, shoving the panic deep into her lungs. She stepped back out to Mark, the mask of a composed wife firmly in place. The SUV's tires crunched over the manicured gravel as they turned into the Caldwell family's ancestral driveway. The massive wrought iron gates swung shut behind them with a heavy, metallic thud that signaled the end of any possible retreat. Ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss cast long, skeletal shadows across the white facade of the mansion, which loomed over Emma like a fortress. Mark killed the engine, and a ringing silence filled the cabin, broken only by the frantic drumming of Emma's heart against her ribs. She stared at the brightly lit windows of the drawing room, where the silhouettes of guests moved in a slow, graceful dance of high society. Anxiety tightened its grip on her throat as she realized the scale of the performance required of her. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle before stepping out into the biting evening air. Evelyn Caldwell stood at the summit of the marble staircase, her arms folded across her chest as she dissected her daughter-in-law with a glacial gaze. The moment Emma crossed the threshold, Evelyn's nose wrinkled in a choreographed display of distaste, and she pressed a lace handkerchief to her face. Her voice, sharp and carrying, rang through the foyer, ensuring the staff and the early arrivals heard every syllable. She remarked loudly that the scent of cheap flour and burnt grease seemed to have permeated Emma's very skin. Emma went rigid, the blood rushing to her face under the collective stare of the household. Evelyn adjusted her pearl necklace, continuing a monologue about how some odors were simply too stubborn for even the most expensive perfumes to mask. Emma clutched her clutch bag, fighting to keep her hands from trembling. Emma moved into the vast drawing room, where the crystal chandeliers cast a blinding, unforgiving light over the assembly. The hum of conversation died instantly. Dozens of pairs of eyes swiveling to calibrate her appearance and her posture. Evelyn's circle of friends exchanged knowing glances, whispering behind their fans while casting looks of performative pity toward the newcomer. Men in tailored tuxedos regarded her with a cold, detached judgment, as if she were a carrier of some middle-class contagion. Emma felt like a specimen pinned to a board in a museum, a curiosity displayed for the amusement of the elite without any means of defense. Every step across the plush Persian rug felt like a mile, the weight of the room's silent condemnation pressing down on her shoulders. Emma's fingers felt numb as they curled around the stem of a chilled champagne flute, the bubbles stinging her nose as she took a shallow sip. Mrs. Harrington leaned in, a saccharine smile plastered on her face, and inquired about the tremendous success of Sugar String during the holiday season. Emma forced her lips to curve upward, spinning a narrative of long lines and exclusive new recipes. Her voice remained steady as she described an imaginary expansion of her inventory, even as the image of the termination notice burned in her mind. She nodded in time with the other woman's chatter, skillfully sidestepping pointed questions about recent rumors of inspections. Inside, her soul was screaming at the injustice. But outwardly, she was the picture of a thriving business owner whose trajectory was only upward. Evelyn began a slow, predatory circuit of the room, eventually coming to a halt directly in front of Emma. Her eyes shimmered with a cold, triumphant light, and a faint, sharp smile played at the corners of her thin lips. She raised a single, perfectly groomed eyebrow, letting Emma know that every syllable of her fabricated success had been heard and catalogued as a lie. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning raced down Emma's spine at the silent promise of an impending strike. Evelyn didn't speak. She simply watched, her presence a suffocating weight that signaled the end of the opening act. Evelyn's voice, sharp and clear as a glass breaking on marble, sliced through the low murmur of the party. She stepped into the center of the rug, her silk gown whispering against the floor as she commanded the room's attention. Her lips twisted into a grimace that a stranger might have mistaken for grief, but Emma recognized the steely glint of a hunter. Evelyn let out a long, dramatic sigh, pressing a hand to her silk-clad bosom as she spoke of the unfortunate collapse of Sugar String. She lingered on the word bankruptcy, rolling it around her mouth like a vintage wine. Emma felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing into her like ice-cold needles, the atmosphere in the drawing room turning thick and suffocating. From a small, beaded reticule, Evelyn withdrew a crisp, white envelope and held it out toward Emma with the very tips of her fingers. Through the expensive paper, a figure with a staggering number of zeros was visible, written in Evelyn's practiced, elegant script. She accompanied the gesture with a short, dry laugh, labeling the check a modest unemployment stipend for a relative who had failed at a simple trade. Emma stared at her mother-in-law's hand, noting how the buffed, pointed nails resembled the talons of a hawk. A ripple of muffled laughter moved through the guests, and Emma felt the heat of pure humiliation sear her neck, her breathing becoming more labored than the tight corset of her dress should allow. Emma pressed a palm to her temple, feigning a sudden, blinding migraine, and began to back away from the circle under Evelyn's gloating stare. She slipped through the heavy doors into the silent corridor, where the thick, velvet curtains muffled the sounds of the gala. She moved quickly toward the rear of the house, her fingers finding the cold bronze handle of the late patriarch's study. The room smelled of old leather, stale tobacco, and the dust of decades. Emma shut the door and leaned her back against the wood, listening to the frantic thudding of her heart in the gloom. The darkness of the study felt like the only sanctuary left in a house built of poison and performance. In the faint light of a street lamp filtering through the slats of the blinds, Emma spotted a pale rectangle resting on the massive mahogany desk. She approached with soft steps, her fingers brushing against the cool, glossy cardstock of a legal folder. The logo of Blackwood & Associates, a firm notorious for aggressive asset liquidation, sent a jiver through her. She traced the embossed letters with her fingertips, feeling the sharp edges of the typography, a knot of dread tightening in her throat. The study, once a symbol of family stability, had been repurposed into a war room dedicated to her destruction. She held her breath, terrified that even the rustle of her dress would betray her presence in this forbidden sanctum. Emma flipped the folder open, and under the glow of the desk lamp, a series of invoices from Evelyn's private foundation spilled out. She scanned the names of the health inspectors and the dates of the random checks, which aligned perfectly with the visits that had crippled her bakery. In a separate sleeve, she found printed screenshots of the vitriolic reviews, accompanied by receipts showing payments made to the reviewers. Rage turned her fingertips numb, the letters on the page dancing as her vision narrowed. Every dollar documented here was a nail Evelyn had personally driven into the coffin of her life's work. Emma clamped her jaw shut to keep from screaming at the sheer, calculated coldness of the betrayal. At the very bottom of the stack, Emma found a carbon copy of a letter addressed to her landlord. The text, bearing Evelyn's sweeping signature, offered a triple market value rent payment on the condition that Emma's lease be terminated immediately. The date on the document was from 3 months ago, a time when Evelyn had been smiling at her over Sunday brunch. Cold sweat broke out on Emma's brow as she realized her eviction hadn't been a result of bad luck. It had been a preordained execution. Every clause and every line of the letter was saturated with Evelyn's desire to erase Emma's independence and remove her from the family circle. The rhythmic, heavy click of heels echoed from the hallway, a sound Emma recognized as belonging to Evelyn's personal assistant, Mr. Graham. She moved with a desperate speed, snatching the original invoices and the letter from the folder. With no time to think, she unfastened the top of her dress and shoved the stiff, cold papers against her skin, hidden beneath the bodice. The chill of the paper made her flinch, the sharp corners biting into her flesh as she adjusted the fabric. She snapped the folder shut and stood tall, forcing her breathing to level out just as the footsteps stopped directly outside the study door. The door swung open, and Mr. Graham paused on the threshold, his gray eyes narrowing as they swept the room. He adjusted his spectacles and stepped toward Emma, his voice sounding like the grating of metal on metal as he delivered his message. He informed her that Evelyn was displeased by her long absence and demanded her return for the celebratory toast. Emma felt the hidden papers crinkle with every shallow breath, the sound seemingly deafening in the dead air of the study. She forced a hollow smile and a nod, keeping her eyes strictly away from the folder on the desk as Graham watched her with a predator's patience. Emma followed Graham down the long hallway, pausing for a fraction of a second as they passed the open door of the small lounge. Inside, shrouded in a haze of blue cigar smoke, Mark was leaning back in a leather armchair, his head thrown back in a fit of genuine, easy laughter. He raised a glass of amber scotch, clinking it against his father's, looking entirely unburdened by his wife's whereabouts. Emma saw the relaxed lines of his face and felt something inside her snap. There was no worry in his eyes, no glance toward the door. He was enjoying the evening while her world was being dismantled feet away. She turned away, the cold bite of the stolen documents against her heart the only thing keeping her upright. The legal jargon from the folder began to swirl in Emma's mind. Insolvency, transfer of rights, fiduciary takeover. She understood now that Evelyn had prepared a trap where SugarString would be absorbed by a shell company under the Caldwell umbrella. The plan was to break her spirit and then present a rescue package that required her to sign away her business in exchange for debt relief. Emma felt a surge of fury replace her fear as she realized she was being handled like a pawn to be swept off the board. Her signature on the earlier check would have been the first step in a legal suicide, a script written by her mother-in-law to ensure her total erasure. Emma locked herself in the powder room, staring at her reflection under the unforgiving vanity lights. Her perfect hair felt like a helmet, and her bold lipstick looked like war paint for a battle she hadn't known she was fighting. She saw clearly how Evelyn had leveraged the Caldwell name to corrupt landlords and weaponize the city's bureaucracy. Months of a slow-motion siege, hidden behind tea and pleasantries, were now laid bare like the filthy lining of a designer coat. She splashed her hands with cold water, the resolve in her veins feeling more like liquid lead than blood. She was no longer a victim. She was a witness to a crime committed in a house of silk and silver. Emma swung the doors of the ballroom open and strode into the gathering with her chin high and her eyes like flint. Every step across the carpet felt like a drumbeat, and the stiff edges of the documents beneath her dress served as a constant reminder of the weapon she carried. Evelyn turned toward her, a fresh insult already forming on her lips. But she faltered as she met Emma's impenetrable mask of calm. The air around Emma seemed to hum with static, and the surrounding conversations died out under the sheer weight of her presence. She took a fresh glass from a passing tray, her hand perfectly still as she locked eyes with her mother-in-law. The war for Sugar String was changing, and Emma was finally ready to fire. The double doors to the dining hall groaned on their hinges as two servers in starched livery carried in a massive silver platter. Atop it sat a 4-tier cake draped in a gossamer web of spun sugar that glinted under the candlelight, a cruel mimicry of Emma's bakery. Evelyn straightened her spine, her hand moving in a sharp, regal gesture to direct the guests to their place cards. The sound of heavy chairs scraping against the oak floor and the rustle of silk filled the room as the party settled around the long table. The scent of caramelized sugar from the cake felt like a suffocating shroud to Emma. Evelyn surveyed the room with the look of an empress, savoring the absolute control she held over every soul in the room. Evelyn rose from her chair, and the sharp ring of her gold spoon against a crystal flute brought an immediate, heavy silence to the table. Her voice was a low, melodic purr as she announced Mark's appointment as vice president in Seattle. She emphasized the word immediately, her eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light as she discussed the necessary relocation to the other side of the country. Emma felt a wave of icy numbness wash over her chest, her lungs struggling to pull in the stagnant air. Evelyn prattled on about new horizons and the prestige of the Caldwell name, acting as if Emma were a piece of furniture to be moved. Every word was a lead weight, sinking any hope Emma had of staying to fight for her bakery. Mark kept his gaze fixed on the rising bubbles in his champagne, his neck stiff as he avoided Emma's eyes. When Evelyn paused, waiting for the public confirmation of her victory, Mark gave a short, jagged nod. His fingers white-knuckled the stem of his glass, the muscles in his jaw working as if he were chewing on glass. He uttered a quiet yes, a single syllable that confirmed the liquidation of Sugar String, and their flight to Seattle had been decided without a single word to his wife. Emma saw him push his plate away, a physical gesture of distancing himself from her. His betrayal felt like a blow to the solar plexus, leaving a metallic tang of copper and ash in her mouth. Evelyn tilted her head, her face adopting a mask of oily, performative sympathy for the benefit of the gathered socialites. She began to lecture the table on how the collapse of the bakery was actually a divine blessing, freeing Emma from a tiring and ultimately fruitless hobby. She dismissed Emma's years of labor as a charming little distraction that had finally run its course in the face of Mark's career. Emma watched the other women at the table nod in agreement, their smirks partially hidden behind linen napkins. Evelyn was grinding Emma's professional pride into the carpet, turning her life's work into a social gaffe to be forgotten. Every word was a drop of venom designed to dissolve the last of Emma's resistance. Emma pushed her chair back, the screech of wood against the floor sounding like a scream in the quiet room. Mark made a sudden, desperate grab for her wrist, trying to pull her back down into her seat, but she wrenched her arm away with a violence that shocked him. Instead of the tears or the frantic pleading they expected, Emma began to applaud, a slow, rhythmic, and hollow sound that echoed off the high ceilings. She stood as straight as a spear, her emerald dress vibrant against the muted tones of the room. The silence in the dining hall became so dense that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a hammer. Emma stared at Evelyn with a terrifying, serene clarity that made the older woman's smile falter. Emma reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out the bundle of crumpled, body-warmed documents. With a single, snapping motion of her wrist, she fanned the papers across the white linen tablecloth, sending them sliding into a puddle of sauce near Evelyn's plate. The sheets scattered across the silver and crystal, their blue seals and bold signatures exposed to the light. Evelyn recoiled as if a snake had been dropped onto the table. Emma leaned forward, her palms flat against the wood, looming over the matriarch while the guests craned their necks to see the contents of the pages. The air in the room vibrated with tension, and the tablecloth beneath Emma's fingers bunched into small, nervous ridges. Emma's voice was low and precise as she began to read the figures from the first invoice, detailing the transfers from Evelyn's personal trust. She recited the exact amounts paid to the health inspectors and read the excerpts from the letter to the landlord regarding the triple rent bribe. The guests froze, forks halfway to their mouths, their faces contorting as the scandal unfolded in front of them. Emma turned the dining room into a courtroom, making Evelyn the primary defendant in a case of systematic harassment. The rustle of papers being passed from hand to hand filled the room as the curiosity of the elite overcame their loyalty. Emma didn't pause for breath, burying Evelyn under a landslide of indisputable facts. Evelyn's face broke out in blotchy, crimson patches, and she slammed her palm onto the table, making the silverware dance. She surged to her feet, her chest heaving as her voice rose to a shrill, jagged shriek, accusing Emma of being a common thief for raiding her private study. She screamed about ingratitude and the vile attempt to smear the Caldwell name just to save a failing bread shop. Her fingers clawed at her napkin, shredding the fabric into a shapeless mass while she tried to burn Emma down with a look of pure hatred. She looked to the guests for support, but they only shrank back into their chairs. The mask of the refined lady had been torn away, leaving only a cornered, snarling predator. Mark reached out and took one of the invoices, his eyes tracing his mother's bold, distinctive signature next to the bribe amount. Emma watched the color drain from his face, leaving him a sickly, ghostly white under the chandeliers. He looked from the date on the paper to Evelyn, then back to the document, connecting the day of the first inspection to the moment the money had moved. His hands began to shake, the paper rattling in his grip with a dry, treacherous sound. He looked like a man watching the ground vanish beneath his feet, his entire reality dissolving into ink and paper. Emma saw the moment he realized his promotion was nothing more than a reward for her destruction. Evelyn stepped toward her son and gripped his shoulder, her voice dropping into a flat, metallic tone. She delivered a final, brutal ultimatum. He would either declare the documents to be crude forgeries and throw Emma out of the house, or he would be stripped of his inheritance, his name, and the Seattle position. She spat the words into his face, her nose inches from his, demanding he choose the family's status over his wife's life. Emma saw Evelyn's fingers dig into the wool of Mark's jacket like talons. A dead silence fell over the table, broken only by Evelyn's ragged breathing. The room held its breath, knowing they were witnessing the final collapse of a dynasty. A low, buzzing hum began to rise among the guests, a sound like an approaching swarm of hornets. The Caldwell relatives, dressed in their finest silks and wools, leaned in toward the center of the table, their faces twisted with a mix of horror and voyeuristic glee. They whispered behind their hands, the sound an ugly, shifting tide of judgment that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Emma stood at the center of the storm, the weight of their collective gaze no longer crushing her, but fueling the fire in her chest. Mark slowly unpeeled Evelyn's fingers from his lapel, his touch firm and clinical as he moved her hand away. The expensive wool of his jacket smoothed out with a faint rustle as he took a long stride across the carpet, planting himself firmly beside Emma. Evelyn remained frozen, her hand still clawing at the empty air like a broken figurine. Mark's move to Emma's side felt like a physical rupture, a wall of separation falling between him and the woman who had birthed him. He didn't look at his mother for permission. His eyes were locked on Emma's pale, determined face. Finding a new center of gravity, Mark took Emma's hand, his palm warm against her cold skin as he laced their fingers together. His voice lost its usual hesitation, ringing out through the vaulted dining hall as he formally declined the vice presidency and renounced his place in the Caldwell will. The silence that followed was so absolute that the tiny pops of champagne bubbles in the glasses sounded like distant gunfire. He squeezed Emma's hand tighter when he heard Evelyn let out a choked, ragged gasp. The loss of millions of dollars and a century of prestige hung in the air like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. While Mark stood his ground, turning his birthright into ash with a dozen words, Evelyn's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness, and her hand lunged for a heavy crystal goblet on the table. With a guttural scream, she hurled the glass at Emma's head, but Mark was already moving, stepping in front of his wife to shield her with his own body. The crystal shattered against the oak floor at his feet, erupting into 1,000 shimmering shards. A sliver of glass sliced a thin, crimson line across the leather of Mark's shoe. But he didn't flinch, his back forming a solid barrier between Emma and the woman at the head of the table. The smell of spilled wine rose from the floor, the shards vibrating as they caught the light of the chandeliers. Mark began to pull Emma toward the exit, their footsteps on the parquet sounding like the heavy, final thuds of a hammer. Behind them, Evelyn's voice rose in a sobbing, incoherent shriek, accompanied by the panicked murmurs of the guests who scrambled to get out of the way. Emma felt the heat of 100 judgmental eyes on her back, but she didn't slow down, her rhythm dictated by the steady strength of Mark's stride. The dining room doors slammed shut behind them with a heavy, definitive thud, cutting off the toxic atmosphere of the gala. In the hallway, the air felt thin and sharp, though the echoes of Evelyn's curses still rang in Emma's ears. In the cavernous foyer, Mark lunged for the ornate key cabinet and ripped a set of keys with a worn leather fob from its hook. Mr. Graham tried to block their path, his arms outstretched as he stammered about Evelyn's orders. But Mark moved through him, nearly knocking the assistant over with his shoulder. The metallic jingle of the keys in Mark's hand sounded like a victory bell in the tomb-like silence of the house. Emma saw Graham shrink back, his eyes wide with fear, not daring to touch the man who had just burned down his own life. They burst through the front door, leaving the gold leaf and the silent, terrified servants behind them. The massive oak door flew open, and a wall of freezing rain slammed into Emma's face. The downpour soaked through her silk dress in seconds, the fabric clinging to her skin as Mark's jacket turned a heavy, sodden black. They ran down the marble steps, their shoes splashing through deep puddles, the cold water washing away the scent of expensive perfume and the lingering dust of the bakery. Thunder rolled through the sky, drowning out their ragged breathing, and a flash of lightning illuminated the mansion like a gargantuan tombstone. Emma felt the cold biting into her bones. but the sharp pain was the most honest thing she had felt all night. Mark vaulted into the driver's seat of a parked sedan, and the engine groaned to life with a rough, mechanical cough as he turned the key. Emma slammed her doors shut, the scent of old leather and gasoline filling the cabin and pushing out the memory of Evelyn's roses. The tires screamed against the wet gravel, kicking up plumes of mud toward the manicured lawns. Mark floored the accelerator, and the car lurched forward, racing past the wrought iron gates that were already swinging shut in the rearview mirror. Emma didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the rain-streaked windshield as the golden lights of the mansion faded into blurred, yellow specks in the dark. Mark slowed the car near the curb, the headlights cutting through the gloom to illuminate the front of Sugar String, now crisscrossed with bright red notice of seizure tape. Emma pressed her forehead against the cold glass, staring at the empty shelves where her croissants had sat that morning. The white seals on the door looked like scars, and the darkness inside the bakery was a silent, heavy weight. Mark didn't speak, giving her a moment to memorize the shape of the sign before the night swallowed it. Emma closed her eyes, holding onto the image of her first dream, and let out a long, shuddering breath, finally letting the grief go. Emma pulled her phone from her bag, the screen smudged with raindrops, and opened her contact list. Without a second of hesitation, she hit the delete button on Evelyn's name, then systematically erased the numbers for the family lawyers and the trust executors. Each tap of the screen came with a soft, digital click that sounded to Emma like a lock turning open. When the list was empty, she locked the phone and dropped it back into her bag, feeling the crushing pressure in her chest finally dissolve. The weight of the papers hidden in her dress no longer felt like a burden, but a simple receipt for a life she was leaving behind. Mark turned to Emma, the dim light of the dashboard highlighting the new, hard lines of his face. He spoke quietly about a small, private account he had opened years ago, one Evelyn had never known existed. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to rent a van and buy fuel to get them across the state line, far from the reach of the Caldwell name. Emma listened to him, and in her mind, the floor plan of a new bakery began to take shape. One that smelled of real vanilla and honest work. Mark put his hand on the gear shift, waiting for her word, a spark of genuine excitement in his eyes for the first time in his life. Emma placed her hand over Mark's, feeling the heat of his skin and the solid strength in his grip. For the first time in weeks, a real, unforced smile pulled at her lips, crinkling the corners of her eyes. The highway stretched out ahead of them, the headlights of oncoming cars turning into long, golden threads that stitched through the darkness. She looked at Mark's profile, seeing a man who was no longer a shadow of his mother's will. The vibration of the old engine thrummed through her body, filling her with a wild, terrifying joy for the unknown that lay beyond the next mile marker. The old sedan roared under a massive highway sign marking the city limits, leaving the Caldwell's world in the dust. Emma rolled down her window, letting the wet night air rush in to tear apart her salon-perfect hair. The muffled sound of the city faded, replaced by the steady, rhythmic hum of the open road, while a pale gray line began to break the horizon ahead. Mark shifted gears, the car surging forward into the dawn.